friends, and welcome to Little Giant Crafts. Today's our first craft. Are you excited? I wanted to start with something simple, so we're doing tar pits. Now this could be, say, an obstacle for your D&D party, or maybe some hindering or like dangerous terrain for Warhammer or something like that. But I thought it's pretty easy. It took me like a few hours to make, and I thought it'd be a good place to start. So let's go.
If you grew up obsessed with dinosaurs like I did, you probably recognize pictures like this. Tar pits are one of the staples of the prehistoric world, whether or not they were actually that common. Basically, they were natural formations where liquid asphalt broke through to the surface, and it was really dangerous for animals because they would get stuck in it. Because from pictures I've looked at, it kind of just looks like water. So, someone wants a drink, they fall in and they can't get out. And then that would also create what is known as a predator trap, because predators would go to eat the trapped animal and they would also get trapped. The La Brea tar pits are the most famous example. But since, like I said, they kind of just look like water, I want to go with a more unrealistic look and kind of make them look like oil. So that's what I'm going to do. First up, we have the sketch. Normally, for something this simple, I probably wouldn't even do a sketch, but since I'm making a video for it, I decided I'd go ahead and do one anyway. So I'm thinking for these tar pits, I want to do two pieces, one kind of bigger and one a little smaller. For both of these, I think I'm going to do just sort of like bean-shaped. Best way to describe it, it's good for, bodies of water because it doesn't look too man-made. And actually, I'll be completely honest, this is the second time I drew it because I accidentally corrupted the file the first time. Around the edges of the tar pit, I'm going to have land. It's not going to be just the tar. So that's what I'm coloring in here. Alright, so this is sort of a side view of what I've got in mind. I'm going to use pieces of corkboard. I think I'm just going to do 2 layers. I think that'll be a good height. And I'm going to have it, wider on the outside so it does sort of a hill. And then I think I'm going to have it do a straight vertical sort of fall on the inside. I'm not going to layer it both ways. Now I'm drawing this sort of perspective shot because I wanted to get a sense of what it would look like, not just the sort of overhead design. So again, this will be where the tar actually is, and then around it will be the 2 layers of corkboard. Now, since tar pits are famous for sort of being a death trap for wild animals, I want to put some bones in there, so I'm just drawing, like a rib cage, a skull. I'm not going to follow this exactly. I'll see whatever feels right while I'm building it, but this is just to sort of, remind myself of the effect I'm going for. I think the ground is mostly going to be dirt, but I'd like to have a few little patches of green, so just drawing some grass. And a lot of times I like to visualize colors before I paint something. This is going to be just a very simple black tar, brown sand, very pale yellow-brown tan bones. But I just thought I'd give it a quick color to get the effect across. But all right, this is what we're going to try to build. Here are most of the materials I will be using. I've got corkboard for the rocks. Chipboard will become the base that everything else sits on. I've got scissors and a blade to cut the chipboard, pencil to mark out shapes, and the hot glue gun to glue the corkboard onto the chipboard, and also to make the tar. Now, whenever you're building terrain, it's good to have a model nearby so you get a sense of scale for what you're doing. You don't want things to be too big or too little, especially if it's something like a building. For natural things like a tar pit, it's less important, but it's a good habit to get into. This is my scale buddy, Captain America. He's sort of an average size among all my figures. I've got some that are bigger, some that are smaller. You know, he's a good average, so I usually have him nearby when I'm building, and I just, you know, stick him nearby to see how big I want it. I'm just gonna sort of draw a shape, like I said, that sort of bean shape. Just, you know, especially for something like this, it doesn't have to be perfect. Natural shapes can be really anything. I realize this one's gonna have to be a little bigger than I initially made it because I didn't take into account the width of the cork board, making an extra border. So I'm making that a little bigger. All right, and now I am making the second larger tar pit. Sort of just a rough estimate on the border between the tar and the cork board. Again, I sort of have to, you know, resize it, see if a figure will fit inside, if it's a good size for that. I end up, you know, taking up a good chunk of the chipboard, just coloring in where I'm going to want the tar so I don't, especially with so many different lines here, so I don't get confused when I'm cutting it out or, you know, putting the glue on. So now it's ready to cut out. I started using the scissors, but chipboard's a little thick for scissors, so I decided to go with the box cutter. I just cut out the rough shape, and then I use the scissors to sort of, you know, round off the corners and the edges and get some little curves in there, just to make it look a bit more natural. You know, you don't see many pawns with, you know, straight square edges. So now I've got my cork board. The good thing about this is that it's really soft and easy to break apart. So it makes a really nice rock texture once it's painted. So I'm just breaking it into small strips and sort of, depending on the shape, seeing where it fits best and then gluing it down with the hot glue gun. This is also very much up to your choices on, you know, how rocky you want it to be and how you want the pieces to fit together. And now that I've got the first layer done on the small pit, I move to the second, doing the same thing, just sort of going around the edges. And you could make these borders, you know, thicker or thinner, depending on, you know, the aesthetics you're going for. I went for, you know, roughly, you know, the size of a figure's base. And if it's too big, you know, just, you know, rip a little piece off, sort of get it into the right shape. Then once that's done, since hot glue's, you know, dries pretty instantly, you're ready to go on to the next layer. So this one, I made the pieces a little smaller, like I mentioned before, so it's got sort of a hill effect and not just, you know, jutting right up out of the ground. If you're going with just one layer, I think it would be fine. I mean, maybe you could bevel the edges a little bit if you want, but more than one, if the edge is the same size, I think it would just look really unnatural. So that's why I chose to do that. Okay, now it's time to add some bits before the tarring. I've got my bag of skeletons, which is, you know, old dinosaur toys and Halloween decorations. I want to keep this sort of setting neutral, so I don't want, you know, something specifically fantasy or sci-fi. I want it to be more versatile, so I'm just sticking with some sort of basic dinosaur bones that can sort of look generic enough to fit in any setting. I've got this little rib cage looking thing, just sanding down the edges a little bit because it was cut off another piece. And then I've got some other options. I think I'm going to use a skull, these little bits of tail here, you know, just playing around with, you know, what looks good. So once I have an idea of where those are going to go, it's time to start hot gluing again. Now first, I just went back over the cork board in a lot of the cracks and gaps to sort of cover that up and make it look more like a solid piece. But again, this is up to you on, you know, how rocky and fragmented you want it to look. And then I just start hot gluing, working my way from the outside in, just because I think the edges are harder to get, especially working with a bit of an overhang and getting into the creases and everything. Now, as I'm going along, I'm taking the little silica gel beads from my bead
box, and I'm just putting them in, sort of randomly, because once this is painted, the idea is that they will look like bubbles. And I'm sort of trying to go in concentric rings to sort of look like ripples. Makes it look a little more fluid, in my opinion. And then when I get to the spot where I want to put the bones, for the larger piece, I marked them out ahead of time so I would remember like exactly where I wanted them. But once I put the hot glue over that area, I mean, it's glue, so then you can just stick the bones right in, and it's a pretty solid hold. And then I just go back in again and get some of the crevices and cracks and any spots I might have missed. And we're done with that step. All right, now that the hot glue has dried, it's time to apply the sand, or what's generally known as flocking, which can also be grass. But for the tar pits, I'm doing mainly, rocky and sandy, so I'm just using sand. So what I do is coat a section at a time in PVA glue, and then I use not a good brush, an old, garbage brush that I don't use for painting anymore. I have a few glue-specific brushes. I use that to sort of spread it around and make sure I coat everything. Then I pour the sand on. After I give it a second, I turn it upside down, pat it a bit to let any sand that's not completely dry fall off. And, this just helps to not lose sand later on. And then I do the same thing with the smaller piece. And when you're using sand, when I'm using sand, I always try to do it on top of a piece of paper so that when I'm done, I can just fold up the paper and pour it back in, and it makes cleanup a lot easier. All right, now it is time to paint. So for the dirt, I'm doing my usual recipe, which is just cheap apple barrel nutmeg brown for the base coat. So this, especially with sand, I always go pretty heavy just so it, seeps into all the cracks and everything. I'm saying cracks and crevices a lot in this episode, but
say crack again.
Crack.
It needs it. So, I just work my way around. The good thing about this is that with the tar in the middle, it gives me a place to still hold it, so I'm not touching the wet brown paint. And I make sure to get the chipboard on the very bottom as well, and once that's done, I do the same thing on the smaller tar pit and let that dry. Once that's done, I move on to the tar, and I looked up a lot of reference images, and tar pits are really pretty boring looking. They kind of just look like ponds. So I've decided to go with more of an oily look. So I've got a glossy black paint that, looks very wet and shiny. So I'm just going to paint the entirety of the tar in this glossy black color. At this point, if you weren't painting the bones, if they were a color you already liked and you were just leaving it, be careful not getting paint on them. But since I'm going to be painting them later, I avoid them for now. But, you can get a little messy because you can paint over your mistakes. Then I just go in with a normal black to base coat the bones. Normally for plastic and like any sort of toy conversion or, Warhammer figure, stuff like that, I would suggest primer first. Usually I just use a simple spray primer. But for this, since it was just the bones and they were such a small part of the overall piece, I decided to just use normal acrylic paint. The problem with doing this sometimes is that the paint doesn't stick and it comes off easy, but whatever the fossil toys were made out of seemed to work pretty well and hold the paint, so it was a risk that paid off. A lazy corner cutting risk. Now, once the black paint is dry, I went back in because it was easier to see any spots I might have missed, especially in the corners. And I'm just sort of, touching up any spots or any low points that the brush didn't touch initially. Then I do the
the next coat on the dinosaur fossils. This isn't the base coat, but it is the darkest color that will remain visible. So I went with a very dark brown, like dirty bone, I guess. Then I used this territorial beige color to begin dry brushing the sand. Now what you want to do is get paint on your brush and then wipe most of it off, hence the dry and dry brushing. That way it's just barely on your paint, and you're just going to sort of flick it over so it catches all the top edges of things, and it makes the sand, it makes the texture stand out and highlights it. So I'm just going over all of the sand with that color. This is also the recipe I use for almost all of my bases. I like being consistent because then everything sort of looks like it belongs together. I also chose brown sort of dirt for this reason because in my mind it's something you could find in almost any environment. If you have something like a snow base and then you're playing on a lava planet, it might look weird, but I feel like, you know, you could have dirt like a melted patch of snow. You could have dirt amongst, you know, building rubble, you know, on the bank of a river, things like that. Now I take that same territorial beige and I go over the bones, mainly getting the tops of them so the dark brown remains like a shadow on the bottom, just sort of hitting the edges. And then while I'm waiting for paint to dry, I am adding some more flocking, this time the bits of greenery. So I just put down some Elmer's glue, and then I've got this Wooded Scenics blended turf that I'm just pouring onto the patches of glue and then again patting it off. And I mean, you can go as light or heavy with this as you want. I went for maybe 60-40 dirt to grass. Really just, you know, whatever feels right. Then I let that dry because flock is, you know, very prone to coming off. Then I take a lighter paint, this khaki color, and I'm going over the bones again. The goal here is to paint less of the bone each time, so it gets gradually lighter as it goes to the top. So that way you can also see a little bit of each previous color below it. And this will just give a nice weathered lighting effect. And you want your brush, this isn't quite a dry brush, but you still want your brush to be pretty dry, not have a ton of paint, because it just helps the colors blend a little bit better. And then once again, we go even lighter with this antique parchment. And at this point, this is about as bright as I want it. So I'm really just getting, you know, the very tips and tops of everything. Sort of like the brightest part of where the light would shine on it, if that makes sense. At this point, I decided to go back and clean up the borders between the tar and the dirt, just clean up some of the spots where I painted tar onto the rock, and just sort of, you know, cleaning up my messes a little bit. Then I decide I want the grass to have a little more body to it, so I get out some moss and I just break it up into small pieces and sort of, you know, stick it around. I do a few pieces on the grass and a few pieces on its own, like where a plant might grow up between the cracks. Just, you know, again, whatever feels right. And with that, it's done. So let's see the final product.
Sarge, what is this place? Fire! Fire!
So there you have it. Tar pits. What do you think? I wanted to keep things simple. I'm really happy with how they came out, especially for how quick it was and how simple. You can really use this technique for things like ponds or like radioactive waste too, depending on what colors and things you put in there. You can do like barrels, toxic waste, shark fins, things like that. Pretty versatile. So that was it, our very first craft together. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any comments or questions, leave them down below. If you want to know what else we're up to, check out the links. And until next time, maybe I'll come up with that word, that thing you say. Jen, what's that thing you say at the end?
An outro?
No, like a catchphrase. Sign off. Maybe I'll think of a sign off. But until then, take care and I'll see you next time. Bye.